Hi, Tom.
Can you see me all right?
Yeah, I think so. A tiny delay, but that's our Wi-Fi.
Right.
So everyone's, you can't see them, but they're all sitting here listening to you.
Hey, Calgary.
And so we're going to start our questions. And I get to read or ask you the first one. So this student wasn't here, but they wanted to know, how did you find out about the issue in regards to water quality?
That's a good question to start with. Usually on Marketplace, we get a lot of emails and phone calls from viewers. A lot of people like to get in contact with our show because they like what we do. And we've got several emails with a similar story about a company called Simple H2O selling these water filter systems. And people felt there was something a bit strange about them, that their sales tactics were a bit unusual. They felt pressured. They weren't sure they could believe everything that they were being told. And they were suspicious. In some cases, people had paid a lot of money and realized that what they'd bought wasn't necessarily what they really needed. So we started looking into the company based on those complaints. And as we dug more and more, we found out more and more things about what they do and how they try to sell these systems, and a bit more about the background of the man behind the company. He had several other business ventures that were also a bit questionable. And that's essentially how the story began. And with most Marketplace stories, from the beginning of the idea to the broadcast is probably several months of work.
Okay, we have our second person that wants to ask you a question.
Has anything changed since the episode?
Since that episode?
Yeah.
Well, we've heard from several people since the program aired, and that was last year, as you know, it was last winter. But since then, we've had several emails from people who either said, I saw your story and they came to my door and I shooed them away, or one person wrote to us and said that she'd actually been approached about working for the company. And she actually went through that job interview process and training that you saw in the story. If you remember the fellow, we had a student wear a hidden camera and go in for training. And this person told us that some of what they were saying had changed. They modified some of their sales pitch and some of their information, but still a lot of what they were doing was not quite on the up and up. And so while they had changed a little bit, they haven't changed completely what they were doing. So there's still a bit of a warning out there for people when this company calls. I think there was a story in Calgary last winter about them as well, because we saw that on, I think, one of the local news programs, that there have been some questions around this Simple H2O as well, the same kind of sales tactics and scare tactics, making people so afraid of their water they didn't want to drink it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Have you covered similar stories to this one?
Say again?
Have you covered similar stories to this one?
Sports?
Have you covered lots of stories similar to this one?
Oh, sorry. Thanks. Yeah. So, a lot of the story ideas, again, we get from viewers deal with things, with lack of a better term, scams, or at least products that don't necessarily live up to what the people say they do, or they tell you it's A when it's really B. And so, yeah, I've done a few others. I've only been on the show 2 seasons. This is only my second year on the program. I was a sports reporter for over 25 years. So, so I haven't got a long experience working on the show on Marketplace. But for example, last year we did a show on scams, but we did it from the other way. We kind of held the consumer to be accountable. We said, why do you fall for scammers? These guys do the same old tricks and people fall for them. So we kind of examined the psychology of scamming, and we ran our own scams for the former con man. And we got people fell for it. And so, things like that have been really interesting to do. I'm doing a story actually on this Friday on Marketplace on Weedman. And Weedman's the biggest lawn care company in Canada. And they do some pretty unscrupulous things when it comes to doing business. They're not a scam so much as their sales tactics are questionable. They're law here in Ontario, and similar things in other parts of Canada. So we try to expose wrongdoing in whatever way we can. When people are being victimized, we're there to protect them, to champion them, and hopefully stop these kind of practices. So I've done a few pieces, a couple of other pieces similar to the water story, but I like variety in the things we do, and so I've been fortunate to do a pretty good variety since I started.
Thanks.
Did the water purificator they're trying to sell you work at all?
Well, that's an interesting question. The system is called something. It's called reverse osmosis, and what they do, what the process does, not just necessarily their system, but the reverse osmosis water system takes everything out of the water. I'm telling you, everything, including calcium, all the minerals that are good for you, are taken out of the water. So, and what this system does, it then puts some of it back as part of the process. However, the system costs, they charge is $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, even more for it. And you could get something similar for hundreds. And for the most part, the experts we talked to said you don't really need it if you're living in a house. If you're living in Calgary in downtown or even the outskirts of Calgary, you don't really need a system like this. If you're on a farm, maybe a water filter system of some kind would be useful. You need that's $5,000 or $6,000 like this. It's pretty elaborate. It's not necessary. So. It does certain things. It does remove material from the water, but as you saw in the story, what they do is when they test their own water and all that stuff shows up in it, that's because and they test your water because your tap water and their water, nothing shows up because they removed all the minerals from it. What's showing up in your water, and they make you think but it's actually just minerals you need anyway. So for the most part, the system, all it does is super purify your water, then they add the stuff back in at the end. And most people we talked, well, virtually all the experts we talked to said it's really not necessary.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
What's the best part about your job?
Oh, the best part? That's a good question. I think for me, when I joined the show, I thought it was important to endure some things that maybe affect change. Fix things, make things better for people. And there's an old saying in journalism that we afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. So essentially standing up for people who don't have much power and stand up for people who have the power and are abusing it. And so to do these kinds of stories means a lot to me personally and professionally. When I was a sports reporter, I covered all the biggest events in the world, and I did a lot of journalism and documentary style programming, and it's, delved into issues in sports which were really important. And I think that was important to do that. But in this show at Marketplace, and they've been doing this for many years, I'm just hopping on the bandwagon, they've been holding people to account, whether it's government or corporations or, salespeople who are fooling you or products that are dangerous or unhealthy. And people really respond to that because they feel, I think Canadians feel they're being hard done by big institutions, whether it's the banks or the cell phone companies or food companies or salespeople trying to make money on make a fast buck off you, take advantage of people when they're vulnerable. So when we're out there, fighting for them, it means a lot. And I did a story a couple of weeks ago on a big landlord who owns apartment buildings all over Canada. And the people living in these apartment buildings were living in really bad conditions, terrible, like mold and broken windows and all kinds of terrible things. And we fixed things for people. They started fixing things up because we were there. And so when you can do that in my line of work, that's pretty valuable. That's one of the best parts of my job.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry. Do they target smaller towns because they think they're more gullible?
Not so much more gullible, I don't think. The company like the H2O does target senior citizens because, and as you remember the woman that I interviewed in the story in that small town in Ontario, it's not so much that she's gullible as opposed to homely or polite. Right? We tend to be very polite in Canada. Sometimes we're too polite. We're not hard enough on people when they start asking us things or asking us to pay for things. So they target small towns, though, in one sense, because it's under the radar. People will they just won't get much attention, and so if they can make inroads that way, it's helpful. They wouldn't be a big city like Calgary, although there were examples of it. We have one in our story in Calgary, and as I said, there was that local story in Calgary. They're not afraid to go into big cities. What they're hoping is to do is scare people. I think you saw that in the story. They were telling people, remember the fellow in Calgary who the salesperson told him, you don't want your kid to have cancer, do you? Well, fix your water supply. And that's that to people. They do that. So it's mostly scaring people. And, in this day and age, there's lots of stuff going on in the world. People are a bit nervous about themselves, and they want to protect themselves. So they play on that fear. And so it's less about gullibility and more about putting fear into people to buy the product. And selling a product based on fear, that should make you a bit wary, I think. You should be hearing people use those kind of tactics.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Hi. Do you write follow-ups on your investigations?
We don't. We often get lots of mail after we do a show, in some cases hundreds and hundreds of emails and phone calls or comments on Facebook and Twitter, and we're on there as well. But we don't always follow up because the way the show works, we're always working ahead. Like many of our stories are shot, beforehand or almost done. So there isn't a lot of room to do quick follow-ups unless something dramatic happens. But last year, for example, we did a show late in the season that I did, which was kind of an update show on the story about gym memberships, which I know maybe some of you saw, and also on a story from the previous year on pet shops in British Columbia. So we do some follow-ups that way, but we don't have a schedule that allows that usually during the season. We sometimes do, though, is when we do a story and there's fallout, sometimes there'll be news coverage. So we'll suggest to the National, for example, on Peter Masbridge's show, hey, there's a story to do with this because we did story A and this happened because of it. It's a good follow-up. So the news people will follow up. We don't know that. But, even next, believe it or not, the 40th season, from the year 40 years next year. It's a lot of stories. So maybe we'll do some follow-ups to a couple of more popular ones to see if anything changes. And our hope is that, like I said to the earlier question, that what we do will help change things for the better.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Hi.
What is the most shocking thing you've discovered on an investigation?
Oh, wow. Well, like I said, I've only been on the show a year. The stories that I did, walking into these apartments where people were living with babies and, or older people, they were living in horrendous conditions. I mean, you just can't believe what people were living in. You wouldn't want to live there, and they certainly, but it was their home. People would say to me, well, yeah, they could move. But the problem is you can't move. The vacancy rate in Canada is 2%. There's nowhere to go. And most of the people who live in these kinds of buildings are middle income or low income communities. They don't have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of power. They're just hoping and expecting that the landlord will fix their building. But this wasn't happening. And I saw stuff that was just ridiculous. But I was in one apartment and there was a hole in the ceiling of the bedroom, like I put my fist through, where water came through and there was mold. There was mold in the ceiling of the closet that hadn't been dealt with for years, literally years. I was in another apartment where there were cracks in the wall, where water was pouring in through a hole in the roof when it rained. And then people living this way for over a year, and the superintendent and I were doing nothing about it. And this is Canada. It was ridiculous. It was terrible. I was really shocked by that. I was very appalled. I was upset. I was embarrassed, that this would be happening. And if you didn't see that show, at the end, we tried to talk to the man who started this company. He lives in a very big, fancy house in one of Toronto's fanciest neighborhoods. And I went to his house and knocked on his door because he wouldn't talk to us. And I wanted people to see where he lived compared to where his tenants lived. And a lot of people who watched that show really liked that when he did that, because getting back to that idea of comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. We did, when I do a story like that on the woman I'm interviewing who has two kids living with her in a small apartment that has mold, we get it fixed and she comes to me and say, thank you. And when I go to the house of the guy who started this company, he lives like a millionaire, fancy big mansion, I want people to see that. And so that was really a shocking story for me to do.
Okay. Okay, this is our last question. How does investigative journalism change your views on our government and its citizens?
It's a good question. We do this kind of work, especially with Marketplace on issues around consumers and the issues they have. What I soon realized doing the show last year was there aren't a lot of options for Canadians. There used to be a lot of consumer advocacy groups across the country. I can remember them when I was younger, but they don't exist anymore. And government doesn't do a whole lot, both at the federal level or the provincial level. The ministries, consumer services don't seem to have a lot of power. They can seem to